Well, welcome back. In our last video, we pretty much finished setting up all the CSS for the positioning of the different elements in our website. And you can see here what we've got set up so far. And we also did a little bit of content formatting when we did these rollovers right up here. But now what we want to go ahead and do is focus on this main content area and getting that styled with CSS. And if we go ahead and take a look at our finished project, you can see the way this heading is looking here, our H2 here, and our H3 here. And that's the first thing that we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to format the H1, H2, and H3s. So let's go ahead, and I'm back here in Dreamweaver, and I'm going to go into Code View for my CSS styles. And I'm going to go ahead and scroll down here under the heading section. Don't format anything up here under Reset. You want to scroll down a little bit further and underneath Headings. Now, this is what's called a grouped selector. And you can see I've got H1, H2, H3, so on and so forth. And what that basically is saying is all these heading styles should be bold and should have a certain color on them. Well, that's actually not true for all of my headings. I've got these headings here are in black, but this is an orange color. So I'm going to go ahead and take this color off of here. I'm going to leave the bold because I want them to be bold for everything. And then I'm going to go ahead and specify the individual font and appearance settings right down here. And again, we're working with the first three heading levels here. So H1, what are H1s going to look like? Well, we can see it's a different color. We can see we have some space below it, a border, and some space below that. So we need to change the font color. We need to apply some padding to the bottom, a thin border on the bottom of the H1, and then some margin below that. So let's go ahead and jump back in here to Dreamweaver, and I'm going to go into H1 here, and I'm going to go ahead and say the padding on the bottom should be, I'm going to say 15 pixels. And this, by the way, you could do this exact same thing basically, or almost, if you did padding 0, 0, 15, 0. And remember, when there's 4 values, it is top, right, bottom, left. The only difference is that that does specify a value, whereas if I do padding bottom, it does not specify any value for the top, right, or left. And then what I want to go ahead and do is I want to put a border on the bottom of my H1 that's going to be 1 pixel. It's going to be a very light gray, so I'm going to go ahead and do the color CCC, and that's going to be a light gray, and I want it to be solid. So I do the width of the border, the color of the border, and the style for the border. Let's go ahead and save this and go back into Design View, and you can see what we've got set up here. I've got some space below that, and there's the border, but then there's my text. I still have to put that margin on. And again, that's a good example of where padding is on the inside of something and margin is on the outside of the object. So I'm going to do margin bottom and also do 15 pixels. We'll save that. Go back into Design View, and there we go. Now we've got some spacing right there. And the last thing that we need to do for this is we need to go ahead and apply some color. I'm going to go ahead and enter and put that on a separate line, and then I'm going to do color up here. And again, it doesn't matter how you set that up as long as your styles are organized. And I'm going to select this orange, and I'm going to drag this down so it's a darker orange. Click OK. Put a semicolon in to end that statement. And now when we go into Design View, there I go. I've got that dark orange with the border underneath it. And if we compare that with our finished project, there we go. Now I need to go ahead and format these paragraphs of text. So I need to format anything that's in a p tag. So I'm going to go ahead now and again go into Code View, scroll down, and there is my p tag. And I want to go ahead and put some margin on the bottom of my paragraphs. That way my paragraphs aren't right up against my images here. I also want to put a little bit of space on the margin or below this down here, but we'll do that later on these images. So I'm going to go ahead and on my p tag, I'm going to go ahead and say margin dash bottom, and that's going to be 15 pixels. And we'll save it. When I go into Design View, there you go. I now have some spacing there, and I also have some spacing that's pushing my footer down there as well. If I wanted to, I could apply some spacing on the top as well. If I was to go ahead and come in here, I could do margin, take the word bottom off, and just say 15:0. And what that's going to do is it's going to apply 15 pixels of spacing on the top and the bottom, 0 left and right. And now you can see that that's pushed that away there as well. You're going to see that the footer has been pushed down quite a bit, and that's because over here this has grown larger. So now let's go ahead and begin to format this information right over here. So we have a date right here, we have an H3 right here, and an H2 right here. Now the H2 actually looks fine. It's the date, and the text looks fine. It's the date that we actually need to format a little bit differently. So I'm going to go ahead and come in here, and I'm going to scroll all the way down into this area right down here. And you can see I've got a couple of P statements in here with left and right on it with a dot. You can assign a class style to be applied to a P tag using this format. But in this case, we don't actually need to do that. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down here a little bit further to below containers to the miscellaneous section. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and I'm just going to create a class style and call it date. Remember to put a period before your class styles, just like you put the number sign, the tic-tac-toe sign, before an ID style. And what I want my dates to be is I want them to be bold, so I'm going to say font weight bold, and I want their color to be that darkish orange color. So I'm going to go ahead and again go into my color wheel here and select sort of a dark orange color right there. And now let's go ahead and save that. And we come into Design View. We still don't see any change. Why? Because we haven't applied the class to that particular item. So I'm going to come back in here to Code View, but I'm going to go into Source Code. And here's a date. Here's another date, and the third one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click in between the P and the closing bracket right there. And I'm going to type a space. And the attribute that I'm going to use is the class attribute. And the class attribute that I'm going to apply is going to be date. We'll save that. Go into Design View, and there I go. My date has now been formatted in that orange color. I'm going to go ahead and do that for each one of these. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and highlight that and copy it, and then paste that in there 2 more times into each one of my dates. And now when I go into Design View, you can see that that has now been formatted. Now, one last thing I want to do with these dates here. If we look at the original, you can see that there's not very much space in between my H3, my sample headline, and my date. But when I look in here, there is much more space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the margin on the bottom of these dates. So I'm going to go into Code View, And there's my date style right there. And I'm going to go ahead and say margin dash bottom. And I'm going to say the margin on the bottom should just be 3 pixels. I don't want it to be very much. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and go back into Design View. And now you can see how that has sort of been tightened up there. So now I've formatted my content area as well as my right-hand sidebar area. And you could tighten up the space after your H3 if you wanted to as well. Maybe I'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and scroll all the way back up here. And there are my H3s. And I'm going to go ahead and say margin, dash bottom is going to be 5 pixels for my H3s. And then we go into Design View, and you can see that's tightened that up as a little bit as well. Now the last thing that I need to go ahead and do is format this footer div right down here. And you can see if I bring up the original here, we have some spacing here, a top border, and some padding in between the wording and the border, and the wording has been centered. So let's go ahead and set that up. I'm going to come back in here to code and scroll down until I find my footer div here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and say margin top should be 20 pixels. And I'm going to go ahead and say border top should be 1 pixel. I'm going to give that gray color, and it should be solid. And we'll save that. Let's see what that does for my footer area. And sure enough, you can see that that has worked out like that. I still have to center that text. Now, if I go ahead and hit enter here, I'm going to tab over. Let's try this, text align center. And going to go ahead and save that. Let's look at this in Design View, and you can see, even when I refresh, nothing has happened. Because what that's doing is it's trying to center the container, not the wording in the container. So what we need to do is we need to do another class style. So I'm going to come back in here, and I'm going to go ahead and scroll down until I find that footer div, and I'm going to take this out of here. Okay. Now, one footer text is something very common that you have to format. So one of these miscellaneous styles here is actually called footer text. And you can see it's making the font just slightly smaller. It's saying the style should be normal, and it's setting the font color. I'm going to go ahead and modify this style here. And I'm going to say the footer text should be 100%. That way it's a 100% of whatever the default is for the page. I could just as easily say 12 pixels there. Either way works. And the color, I'm going to go ahead and change as well. I'm going to say color should be black. And finally, what I want to go ahead and do, is apply that text align property and use the center value on that. I'm going to save that. Now let's go ahead and look in Design View. It's still not centered. What's the problem? Remember, unlike ID styles that you apply when you create the div, unlike IDs that you apply when you create the div, and tag styles that are inherent, class styles have to be manually applied to each piece of text that you want them to affect. When I go ahead and go into my source code for this page, you're going to see nothing in this line says that it should have the class style footer text. So again, I click in the P tag in between the letter P and that bracket, type a space, and I'm going to use the class attribute. And the value for the class attribute that I'm going to use is going to be footer text. And again, that value needs to be in quotation marks, just like all property values. I'm going to go ahead and go into Design View, and now you can see that that has been applied there. One more thing I need to do here is there needs to be a little bit of spacing underneath that so that the beige background color is not right up against this. So I'm going to go ahead and again go into my style sheet in Code View, and I'm going to go ahead and scroll up until I find the footer div, and here I put margin on the top, but I haven't put anything on the bottom of the footer. So what I want to go ahead and do is I'm going to say margin 20 pixels 0. And that way it's going to put 20 pixels top and bottom and 0 left and right. Let's go ahead and save that and go into Design View, refresh this page, and now you'll see some margin on the bottom. I'm sorry, I take that back. You're not going to see any margin on the bottom here. And actually, you do see the margin on the bottom. There's that spacing right there. But you're going to see it isn't filled in with white. And again, this is a very common mistake. I make it all the time. Remember, margin is on the outside of the container, and padding is on the inside of the container. So if I want to push this white down, I need it to be on the inside of the container. So instead of doing margin, what I actually needed to do was apply some padding. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into the code here, and I'm going to go ahead and add a style on here. I'm going to go ahead and say padding bottom, 20 pixels. Save that, and I'm going to return this to, actually I'll leave that alone. Save it and go into Design View, and now I can see that spacing on the bottom of my text there. So we've successfully formatted all of our text. The last thing that we need to do is we need to format these images here. And if we look at the original here, you can see that there's sort of space, there's some spacing around them. There's also a border around them. And there's some padding in between the border and the image itself. This rollover effect we're going to do in another video. So for right now, we're just formatting the images themselves. So I'm going to go ahead now, and these are images in the content area. So let's go ahead now and format those. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into my CSS styles here. And I'm going to go ahead and scroll up, and I actually have a little section here that was created for styles that format images. And what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a class style. And I'm going to go ahead and name this image frame. And around the image, I'm going to want a certain amount of padding. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I should have 10 pixels of padding all the way around my image. I'm also going to say I want a border around my image. And I want that to be 1 pixel, light gray, and solid. And finally, I want some margin around my image. I'm going to go ahead and make that one 10 pixels also. So I've created a class style that puts 10 pixels of padding around an object, then a thin gray border around the object, and then 10 pixels of margin around the object. And when I come in here to Design View, again, you're going to see these images have not been affected, and that's because we haven't applied the class style to them. So I'm again going to go into Code, and I'm going to go into Source Code right here. And there are my two images right there. And what I want to do is I'm going to click right there and add a class style, and I'm going to go ahead and call this, or select image frame as my class style. And I'll copy and paste that into that one there as well. Let's save that and go into Design View, and now you can see my images now have frames around them as well as some spacing. Now, again, there's a lot more to learning CSS than what we've just done right here. And if you want to learn more about using CSS, go ahead and check out my video series on CSS in Dreamweaver CS5. But this is to give you a good firm foundation to get started on designing websites with CSS. Well, now that we have this page formatted, the next thing that I need to do is actually go ahead and create a template from this page and then apply that template to the different pages in my site, such as home, about, products, services, and contact. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and discuss how to create a template inside of Dreamweaver and then how to apply that template to different pages in our site.